So following on from our previous session, we're now going to have a session where we're looking at rethinking disaster readiness at all stages. And I guess it's time now to remind everyone about the internationally agreed Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction, of which Australia is a signatory. And the objectives of that framework are to prevent disaster risk through implementation of measures that prevent and reduce hazard exposure and vulnerability to disaster, and increase preparedness for response and recovery, thereby strengthening resilience. And as we heard in the previous session, disasters are accelerating. And so what are some of the key actions government can take to implement the Sendai framework? Because we do need to be ready for these accelerating disasters. As I said before, it's actually really urgent. So first of all, we need new tools and technologies to prevent disasters where possible. Concerted research missions for transformational solutions are required. And we heard some of that from our students earlier on, but today we're going to hear from Marta Yebra on new tools for protecting Australia from catastrophic bushfires. And there'll always be, even if Marta's work is successful and Jack's work successful, and we don't have bushfires and we don't have cyclones anymore, I think we'll never actually get rid of them altogether. So there'll always be unavoidable loss and damage. So how can we make sure that people are able to recover as quickly and safely as possible? And Caroline Schuster is going to explore the insurance gap and the funding shortcomings, which will help us to implement our part of the Sendai framework as well, if we could get that right. And finally, but last but not least at all, is the community has a huge role to play in working together with scientists to strengthen both community and environmental resistance to disasters. And we're going to hear from Astrid Vachette to speak about this in the context of the research that ANU is doing on partnering with communities to develop nature-based solutions to flood mitigation. So I'm now going to introduce to you Dr. Marta Yebra, who's an associate professor in environmental engineering at the Fenner School of Environment Society and the School of Engineering. Marta is the director of the Research Centre of Excellence supported by ANU and Optus, which aims to protect Australia from catastrophic bushfires through testing and evaluating novel early detection technologies. Thank you very much, Marta. So you just press this to move.
Thank you, Roslyn. So we have heard and we know that managing the bushfires is getting more challenging, and we have now landscapes that are drier and stay dry for longer period of times. So in these situations, we need to develop new technologies, as Roslyn said. And today in my talk, I'm going to present some of such technologies to make bushfire management more efficient in Australia, with a specific focus on early fire detection. So why early fire detection? Well, the earlier we detect a fire, the earlier the resources can be deployed, and the earlier the fire area at initial attack. And as this figure shows, the smaller the area at initial attack, the highest the probability of an initial attack success. So therefore, it's important to explore efficient technologies for early fire detection and to detect these fires accurately, continuously across extended landscapes. The good news is that such technologies exist, but they haven't fully developed, tested, or even less integrated in a specific area and in an efficient way. So this is why our Research Center of Excellence is investigating comprehensive solutions for identifying fires early in the remote bushland areas with a trial in Australian Capital Territory. And I'm going to guide you now through all this integrated approach. So in late February, we installed a lighting detector system that was developed by a US company called Fire Neural Networks in the ACT. This was to test the capability of this system first to triangulate lighting strikes with a precision of 40 meters accuracy, and also to determine the information on the attributes of the lighting strikes that lead to ignitions. This is the long continuing current. So the longer the continuing current, the greater the fuel is heated and the higher the probability of ignition given the same environmental conditions. So this slide presents the results of our investigations in 4 ignitions that happened soon after the installation of the detectors. You can see with a purple star the ignition locations, and then the circles are the lightning strikes identified by our ground network, with the different colors from green to red indicating the low to highest probability of ignition based on environmental conditions. And with the red cycle, I'm very bad pointing, I'm not going to do it. The red cycle indicating those strikes that had long continuing current. So as you can see, most of the ignitions near the ignition point, and the photos around are the photos taken at the source of the ignition. So most of the lightning strikes, most of the ignitions had a lightning strike with either high risk of environmental conditions, given the environmental conditions, or the long continuing current. So what we are currently doing is to try to integrate these both sources of information in artificial intelligence model that can detect the probability of ignition. Yeah. So we have just seen that the environmental variables are very important for lightning ignition probability estimate, but we are also trying to understand exactly which variables are important and why, and in which quantity. So with this study that we just published today, we show that as the vegetation stress increases, the probability of a lightning ignition strike to ignite a fuel also increases. So this is also making a call for more efficient technologies to determine fuel moisture content conditions in the landscape. So the center is collaborating with the ANU Institute for Space in a new satellite mission that will exactly monitor the fuel moisture content condition of the landscape, but also other flammability traits that are determining the flammability of the landscape. And this is all from space. So after our modeling identifies potential lightning strikes, ignitions following a lightning storm, we are exploring also the use of drones for the validation of those ignitions. These drones can enhance the capabilities of current firefighting technologies because they are very fast, they can fly at night, and they are very tough weather conditions where other aerial firefighting resources cannot be deployed. So we believe that these instruments collecting thermal imagery that can be then used to automatically detect ignitions and communicate that information to the rural fire services can also make the fire management more efficient. This drone can be complemented with ground sensor networks that can be strategically located in areas of high ecological value or areas of high risk or in blind points to other technologies where even a faster detection may be needed. So we are conducting experiments with ground sensors nodes that are positioned at different distances and at different angles from fire experiment and also prescribed burnings. And what you can see in this figure are 2 examples of the measurements taken in terms of total volatile organic compounds and equivalent CO2. And you can see that soon after an ignition, oh gosh, I don't know what's happening. But soon after an ignition, you see that extra peak in the signal of the sensor, and that can be used to detect automatically the fires. We are also trying to complement early fire detection using cameras on fire towers. So we have developed novel convolutional neural networks algorithms that can segment exactly the smoke in an image. And this is an advantage in comparison with other algorithms that simply label where a fire might be with a black box, a red, yellow box, as you can see there. Thank you. I think the battery might be. Yes. So, however, these algorithms we have calibrated use mainly data from United States that is publicly available, and there is a huge limitation of data in Australia, and this is limiting the development of these technologies in Australia. So we are initiating a publicly available database of camera images that can be used to further develop this field, and we have initiated this process with the installation of a camera in the Stormblock campus at the ANU. Yes. So this is just a glimpse of all the technologies we are testing and exploring for early fire detection with a specific focus in remote areas and under very extreme weather conditions. But I want to emphasize again that none of these technologies can work individually. So that's why the work we are doing evaluating these technologies to know the advantages and disadvantages and their different situations is very important for an integrated approach. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marta, and everyone. If you would like to ask Marta questions, we're going to have a panel session at the end, and I'm sure she'll be happy to answer any of your questions then. I'd like now to move to a different topic, which is how can we address the insurance gap and funding shortcomings for successful recovery, learning from international experience. And I'd like to introduce Professor Caroline Schuster, who's a senior lecturer at the ANU School of Archaeology and Anthropology. Caroline's Australian Research Council Discovery Early Career Researcher Award explored insurance and disaster relief using the anthropology of finance to rethink climate change adaptation. We're really looking forward to hearing from you, Caroline. It's a very important topic.
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation to speak. I'm an economic anthropologist, so I'll be covering some of the insurance options related to disaster relief, but focusing back on those community concerns and the social dimensions of insurance. So to start us off, one of the major questions facing both disaster financing and the insurance industry is, are we at the point of uninsurability, particularly in climate impacted regions? Next slide. I'm from California, so this story definitely hit home. It was widely reported that in May of this year, State Farm Insurance announced that it will not accept new applications for business or personal property and casualty insurance in California. And those of us who grew up on the West Coast, that jingle, like a good neighbor, State Farm is there. It was sort of all across my childhood, and it's kind of notable that they're the first to exit the market. This was followed in June by Allstate, the fourth largest insurer in California, which also confirmed it will be not signing any new policies. It's estimated that $1.5 billion of insured losses due to flooding have already been claimed this year alone. And of course, 2018, the deadly Camp Fire led to more than $10 billion in insured losses. Again, these are what were actually covered by insurance companies. This has been widely reported in the international press, including Guardian, New York Times. The Vox Technology has an especially comprehensive kind of article if you're interested in the topic. And this follows a trend that we see not only in the US, but in many contexts where insured losses are growing due to climate change. According to Allstate in their reporting or conversations with the San Francisco Chronicle, they note that the cost to insure new home customers in California is now far higher than the price they would pay for policies. And this is due to wildfire, higher costs of repairing homes, and higher insurance premiums. Some in the industry have noted that on the surface, it might seem as though environment, society, and governance, or ESG principles of investing, might help to build community resilience in the face of climate change, and insurance would be a key ingredient of that financing framework. In practice, adopting ESG principles, as for example, NZIA, the Net Zero Insurers Alliance, has done, has led insurers to disinvest because ESG is about protecting the investment portfolio of insurers and their sensitivities to environmental, social, and governance risks. And we end up seeing market exit, such as in California. Next slide, please. And this is a trend that will kind of only increase. Secondary perils are a key concern for the industry, and this was a landmark study by Sigma, the Research Institute of Swiss Re, one of the largest global reinsurers. The term primary perils refers to catastrophes of a large scale, so those are notably tropical cyclones, earthquakes, and winter storms. Secondary perils are events that tend to be less frequent, but result in losses that can be extreme. And these include an umbrella kind of term for natural catastrophes ranging from drought, wildfire, snow, flash floods, landslides, and severe convecting storms. Insured losses from both primary and secondary perils have been on an upward trend since the 1970s, as you can see from Swiss Re's data. And these estimates are estimated to continue to increase. Social scientists, and this is where I'm putting my anthropology hat on, have long noted that natural catastrophes are never just natural. The loss drivers and kind of risk frameworks trends that we see here are revealing in this regard. The impact of secondary perils interact in complex ways with social drivers, including highly stratified housing markets and what anthropologists might call the sociocultural values attached to land and land use that drive people to settle in particular areas. And I'll return to some of these ideas when we talk about community responses. So given the rise of their associated losses in absolute terms, secondary perils need to be better understood for the purpose of more complete risk assessment and sustainable underwriting of natural catastrophe risks overall. So the key point I want to draw for this is that we're seeing a notable upward trend. And at the same time, uninsured losses are expected to follow an upward trend as well, as insurers exit the market in climate impacted regions where risks are unacceptably high. Next slide, please. So in that landscape, what sort of instruments do we have for financing disaster risk? Personal property and casualty insurance make the biggest headlines, especially following media coverage of the growing insurance gap. Anxieties about uninsurability and media reporting on claims denials, such as after the Black Summer fires or the Lismore floods. So I'm going to very briefly sketch out some insurance options for institutional actors, donors, public agencies, NGOs, local governments. And this is by no means a definitive or prescriptive list. It's a broad overview before discussing local and community responses to the insurance gap. Now, next slide. Wait for it. There you go. So this is a landmark study kind of framing those wider institutional responses. A World Bank-led 3-year research project by the UK Department of International Development, World Bank Disaster Risk Financing Insurance Program, and the Global Facility for Disaster Reduction and Recovery, the GDFR. The key takeaway points from kind of dull disasters were that financing instruments will be useful to governments and donors just as they are to insurers. So the kind of tagline of the book is that agencies, especially public agencies, should think like insurance companies. But in the author's framework, for this to be effective, they should be part of the plan and not define the plan. They encourage this landscape of actors to think like an insurance company in the sense that they want them to clarify what contingent liabilities, so what potential financial liabilities might emerge, and who would take responsibility for each one, and that these liabilities should be financed in the most effective way. Next slide. Here's a breakdown of some of those options, and what's notable is that they divide them between financing that's arranged before a disaster and financing that's arranged after a disaster. And the kind of suite of kind of options on the left-hand column are broadly where the insurance kind of sits. And this isn't, again, just about individual policies. For example, Australia's new cyclone pool. This is a reinsurance pool that is an ex-ante risk transfer instrument, a $10 billion government guarantee that serves as a reinsurance arrangement between insurers and the Australian Reinsurance Pool Corporation. And I'm happy to talk more about how that works in the Q&A. But in effect, once the ARPC declares a cyclone event, the pool will cover claims for related damage. Risk transfer and reinsurance for insurance companies, while policyholders in affected areas are able to make claims. And it's funded by charging reinsurance premiums to insurers. Next slide. So to wrap up, I'll present a really brief case study of microinsurance and community response. So as I noted from the very beginning, I'm an anthropologist, so you might be thinking, what on earth brings an anthropologist to disaster risk financing? And the answer is that I started off on a 3-year project working with small-scale sesame farmers in Latin America who are experiencing the effects of extreme weather, such as drought and flood. Despite the alarming impacts of climate change, research has consistently revealed that the demand for disaster insurance among farmers in the global south remains quite low. In my very brief kind of closing minutes, I'll discuss these community responses by drawing on some of these international examples, particularly from low income and climate vulnerable communities. Despite the very different context, I think that there's still some valuable lessons to draw. Next slide. So what does this mean for farmers? The type of insurance that I looked at is called IBI or IBAI, an index-based insurance. So rather than indemnifying farmers for crop losses, instead it's a weather indexed product. So the minute you register drought or flood using a suite of remote sensing technologies, it automatically triggers a payout rather than having to send a claims adjuster around in order to assess losses on the ground. The technical process of converting the multiple and overlapping environmental challenges faced by farmers into a quantifiable index means that the actual protections provided by this novel type of insurance are actually kind of quite complicated to manage. And that in many cases, farmers don't actually see that many benefits. IBI policies also tend to be confined to specific regions and selected crops. And in some cases, with very differentiated land tenure, can exclude women and poorer households from the product. So the introduction of these new insurance schemes, while they have a lot of promise, also can exacerbate inequalities. So what I want to draw from this is that insurance in these cases can unexpectedly amplify risk. So for example, in Paraguay, it locked farmers into growing a cash crop, sesame, which was insured, as opposed to others. This increased their exposure to price volatility and made the ecosystem vulnerable to monocropping, and fungal diseases decimated many of those crops because of the kind of monocropping. It made farmers highly reliant on pesticides, herbicides, and other chemical inputs to manage an unfamiliar crop that was largely alien to Paraguayan foodways. So the benefits of the insurance flowed primarily to their local agricultural cooperative in the form of debt cancellation for all of those expenses that they racked up. Okay, wrapping up. So to conclude, I think that one lesson to draw from this is that we need to think about insurance holistically and to think about community insurance needs holistically. While weather indexed insurance is one solution to kind of disaster financing and recovery, it can have unexpected effects. For example, unsustainable land use policies. If we think about those effects in tandem with the financing, it can lead to perhaps an explanation of why this has not been adopted as widely as we had expected. So we need to ask ourselves about these non-economic values that are surely as important as the economic values when we consider the insurance gap.
Thank you very much, Caroline. That was extremely interesting and a lot of food for thought. I'd like now to introduce Astrid Vachette. Astrid is a research fellow at the Institute for Climate, Energy and Disaster Solutions here at ANU. And Astrid is researching the social and institutional science aspects of the ANU initiative, partnering with regional communities to develop nature-based solutions for flood mitigation, which is funded by the National Emergency Management Agency. In this role, Astrid is leading community engagement through ANU's partner councils. Thank you, Astrid.
Yes, so at ICEDS, we're developing the Australian guidelines for nature-based solutions for flood resilience in partnership with 10 local councils and catchment authorities. Okay. We built a multidisciplinary team to formulate a comprehensive understanding of nature-based solutions. We're developing a framework to define a common perspective and project direction, feeding heavily on hydrological modeling, ecological analysis, and social science, with continuous community engagement. Community engagement entails the inclusion of local communities, not only in the development of research objectives, but also design and implementation. It ensures that local needs are well considered and empowers locals to share their ideas and experiences to influence projects that will impact their communities. Through engagement, we acknowledge and capitalize on existing initiatives led by local groups like Landcare, because believe it or not, communities have not been waiting for us to do a vegetation. Engagement can also build capacity by increasing people's risk awareness. So I'm sure that we can all agree here that there are practical and ethical reasons to engage communities to reduce risks and increase preparedness. But I'm also sure that we can all agree that we can still do better in terms of how we do engagement. I have only 8 minutes, so it's difficult to actually discuss thoroughly about the ethical dilemma of community engagement. So I'm going to focus on two main challenges and how we are trying to address them in our project, which is our pilot study in the Bremer catchment. It is common that research operates on a funding cycle with a project starting up, collecting data, and leaving within 3 years. There is limited time and resources to return or apply the results of research to the community. This is called parachute research. And in general, locals are tired of it. For example, it's not uncommon that countries like Vanuatu and Papua New Guinea implement temporary national bans on foreign research after a wave of extractive research projects. In an article published just a few days ago in Nature, Dr. Mercier relates another issue related to parachute research. How, because she's an indigenous researcher, she receives heaps of tokenistic requests to be part of grant application, curriculum development, and conference speaker notes. And the same is happening among the Australian First Nations communities. Just a handful of indigenous people are flooded with requests to research workshops and interviews, ending up being the voice for several clans and expected to have an opinion on very different topics like natural resource management and cultural practices. Also, across the flood-exposed communities, we are witnessing research fatigue. Such experiences result in general mistrust in research. Recent events, such as COVID-19, but also the Lismore floods, really highlighted this growing mistrust in science, scientists, but also disaster managers. Here's a petition from Lismore actually saying that Northern Rivers Reconstruction Corporations failed to actually make appropriate decisions based on what the community wanted. Our project, but trust is one of the most important determinants of success for community engagement. And building trust is not magical or complicated. It just takes time. It requires tangible evidence that researchers want to invest in meaningful relationships and have a genuine plan to integrate local knowledge and ideas and to return to the communities with findings. Our project, like many others, has a short lifespan, which makes this difficult. So we developed an engagement strategy adapted to both the short-term nature and the long-term objectives of our project. So first, we're creating a local community of interest, working with us on the development of our framework, in which we are integrating community priorities flagged in previous studies and exploring these priorities through the nature-based solution lens. We will meet regularly with our community of interest over the next year, and together, we will identify and assess combination of mitigation strategy. Second, we are looking into hiring our research assistants among community groups like Land Care and local organizations to capitalize on and enhance local expertise. Third, we're developing a network, including government agencies, non-government organizations, community groups, local associations, and other university teams who are involved in long-term relevant programs in the Bremer catchment. This network is becoming a pool of resources to reduce research fatigue, to share lessons learned, but more importantly, to integrate our research findings into their longer-term programs. Through these networks, we also benefit from relationships already established in the community. Community stress. What stress? Well, when we started our project, some of our partner local councils were in middle of flood response or early recovery. Communities were and still are suffering from stress and trauma from the 2022 floods. And let's not forget that our local councillors and disaster managers and natural resource managers are all part of the community and were directly affected themselves. Anyone would struggle at that point to pool resources to think of long-term mitigation strategies in a safe and effective manner. But we do not have the luxury of waiting to develop mitigation strategies. And today, while evidence of the devastation of the 2022 floods is still visible, communities are beginning to anticipate drought. Drought promises challenging years to come, and this compounds the psychological effects for us discussing flood risk management with exposed communities. We're a bunch of ecologists and hydrologists and economists and social scientists. And we really want to be very mindful when talking to research fatigued communities about these stressful topics. Therefore, the aim and design of our project try to minimize stress associated with extractive research and disaster by giving the community a safe space to explore options and strategies according to their own priority, guided by expert opinion and data. So how do we do this? Well, while our project focuses on nature-based solutions to floods, we put a significant emphasis on the co-benefits of these strategies. These co-benefits, ecological, social, psychological, and economic, with a multi-hazard lens, are translated into motivations for the community to engage in our project. Through such strategy, our work remains fluid, and it's able to adjust to what is important to our community partners at the time we engage with them. And it may change each time we talk to them, and that's okay. Because overall, it will build a comprehensive understanding of how nature-based solutions can help to build socio-ecological resilience of communities vulnerable to floods. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Astrid. I think now is the time when you can all ask Astrid and the other speakers their questions. And so start saving up your questions, because I'm going to invite all the speakers to come and sit here on these very comfy looking chairs with their microphones. And hopefully you can ask them some questions. Questions from the non-online present audience. Yes, thank you.
I have a question from you. I forgot your name. Sorry. Yeah. One of the projects you were talking about was the tower cameras in the ACT. And you mentioned that neural network is going to be used there. So neural networks. Yeah. So I'm interested in knowing more about this in detail. Can you explain more how AI and neural network is using in the tower cameras? Thank you.
Well, I can probably not go into the detail of the algorithm because I didn't develop the algorithm. It was another principal researcher called Nick Barnes who developed the algorithm, and his team. But at high level, basically, we feed the algorithm with data coming from the camera towers. As I said, mainly the data is principally coming from the United States at the moment, because there is a large publicly available database from there. And there is a little bit of data coming from some towers we help with installation in the ACT. And then basically you feed the algorithm with that data. The algorithm learns to identify the smoke. In the algorithm, you also feed a background imagery with known fires. So the algorithm also learns to identify no fires. You have images with foggy conditions and other potential atmospheric events that may be confused with the smoke. So the algorithm learns to distinguish between those two.
Thank you. Yes, John Blackson again. Marta, I'm wondering, what you talked about is very reassuring, given that 20 years ago, we had a major disaster with fires striking Canberra. How confident are you with this new arrangement that will beat it next time? Thanks.
I have the answer at the end of the 5 years of the center, because that's what we are evaluating. But I think I'm quite confident, because combining all these technologies, you can have a faster response. I mean, you can have a faster detector, and that facilitates a faster response. But if you only work on the size of detection, you won't be able to do anything at all. You also need to develop technologies for faster suppression, and the work that the students have presented earlier in the day, unfortunately, I missed that talk, is very relevant, because again, both things need to come hand to hand. There's no point to develop early fire detection if you don't suppress the fires early as well. So again, in terms of the capability we are developing, we are especially focusing on lightning strikes in remote areas because those are the situations where the current practices fail the most because there are no public to report those fires. Those fires are very difficult to access, and by the time that they are detected, most of the times they are out of control and too large for effective first attack success. So that's where, again, we are trying to find a specific needs. So we are not going to solve fire detection in all situations, but in those specific situations where we think these technologies can be more favorable.
Thanks very much, Marta. I have an online question from Dion for Caroline. Caroline, you spoke about insurance. This is a very long question. You spoke about insurance having the potential to lock in unsustainable land use. However, does that same concept of unsustainable land use come into thinking when we have many communities in Australia that have created built environments in known floodplains undertaking ex-ante financial arrangements?
I think that I'll share this question with Astrid because you know much more about the kind of flood landscape in Australia. I should note that what's interesting about insurance for disaster response, particularly for agrarian communities, and in the global south, there's been very low uptake of insurance solutions and a big push from aid agencies to kind of roll those out in order to protect communities. What we should, as I kind of alluded to, take note of is that the features of those policies can lock farmers into decisions that might end up putting them at greater risk to some of those climate effects. For example, growing crops that in the long term may be more sensitive to some of those climate vulnerabilities, or kind of locking land use to a particular financial arrangement, which may not be good for community resilience, kind of broadly conceived. In terms of housing, there's been kind of related discussions about whether the insurance kind of regimes that we have now, for particularly around property, are also kind of amplifying kind of risky building in some kind of areas. And that's a conversation that's happening in California around kind of fire. But what's sort of kind of notable here is about how slippery that idea of sustainable is. If you're thinking about sustainable land use, it can mean a lot of different things in different areas. Taking lessons from some of the agrarian communities in the global south, and particularly the kind of complexities of the risks that they face when they lock themselves into a financing regime, is broadly speaking a principle that we can bring back to think about development kind of more broadly, but sometimes the kind of exact kind of similarities don't translate directly. Astrid, do you have some thoughts here?
Well, we are looking at what the insurances are thinking in our project. It is really infant type of thinking. So they're really interested in actually finding out what our modeling is going to say. They are doing a lot of modeling as well, like you had a lot of Swiss Re. So we're, working with them and discussing with them. And the big question, which kind of like goes back and forth, is whether if nature-based solutions are seen or expected to have an impact, whether that will have incident on the premium levels. And that's kind of one of the big questions that they are feeling a little bit, unsafe of being giving a direct answers on that. But yeah, it's this big question of if nature-based solutions are capable of having an impact on especially minor floods, then whether insurances should start investing in those big, large-scale projects as well. And what does that actually mean in terms of the government's responsibility to invest in them if the private insurances go into it?
Thanks very much. Are there any other questions in the room? Yes, there's two hands up at the back. Damon.
Am I first? I got the microphone. Excuse me. Thank you for your talks. And I've got an insurance question. Please correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is uninsurable means unprofitable. And if there's a gap in the commercial market for insurance. Surely there's room for not-for-profits or, God forbid, government insurance to step in and actually take this and spread the risk and spread the cost of disaster. Have you got a comment on that?
Yeah, so thinking back to the kind of table that kind of I popped up there, almost all of those insurance facilities are aimed at institutional actors, not at the private insurance market. And there's sometimes synergies between them. For example, the Cyclone Fund that's been rolled out here in Australia relies on private insurance. It's essentially trying to make cyclone insurance kind of profitable again for insurance companies, or make them willing to insure kind of individual property owners by creating a reinsurance facility where some of that risk can be transferred to the reinsurance fund. So there's lots of sort of interactions between kind of private insurers, reinsurers, where you can kind of transfer risk, and then government support for those reinsurance facilities. One thing that's sort of notable in that landscape is that a lot of that conversation is really about kind of how do we build resilience within the financial services industry, right? And that divorces that conversation from how do we actually protect communities. If the dominant conversation is like, how do you build robust financial institutions, it can leave communities sort of out of the picture. We see this in the Global South as well. For example, with microfinance organizations that notice that among their clients that are susceptible to or kind of vulnerable to climate risks, for example, the effects of El Nino, they might buy an insurance product indexed to kind of the weather in order to kind of create resilience within their investment portfolio, knowing that many of their clients are going to default. That doesn't actually help the defaulting clients. It helps the financial institution kind of maintain its financial footing. So when we think about those institutional actors, it's important to keep kind of end users as part of the kind of discussion, since too often it's about sort of creating that basis for resilience within financial services.
Thanks very much. I'll take another question online and then we'll go back. I think, oh, Damien, you want to ask now, sorry.
Hello? Yeah. Okay, I have a question for Marta, and that is, so the smoke detecting algorithm, is that run on the drone or on like a ground computer? And if it's run on a ground computer, is there like some kind of communication network to like how many drones connected to the ground computer kind of stuff?
So the smoke detection algorithm at the moment is only run on the cameras. So it's for the imagery from the cameras on the towers. The drone detection is based on thermal imagery. And we haven't yet developed an automatic algorithm for detecting ignitions with the thermal imagery. That's something that we will do as soon as we start to collect the substantial data from fires from the drone to calibrate the algorithm.
Thanks. I'm sorry, that was Martin, not Damon. It's really hard to see with the lights in my eyes. So now I have a question online from Heather for Astrid. Heather says, I'm interested in the large COG research network in Astrid's presentation. If the purpose is to allow community to integrate research into local solutions, where are all the other solution providers in your work? For example, local government, emergency services, etc. How do we connect the work of key decision makers or resource providers and local communities?
Yeah, thanks. Obviously, this is what I presented today was just a very, very small sand into our massive project. And so it was just about the community engagement, but we have a very strong institutional analysis pillar in our project, which is looking at the process of decision-making and how all the local, state, and federal decisions, plans, policies, programs are actually coming into play. This network that I'm talking about is also trying to have a much broader and comprehensive understanding of nature-based solutions that go beyond our resources, which involves 3 researchers and a half. And so we are obviously integrating all the strategies that are being looked at across non-governmental organizations, local associations. There are a lot of groups, especially in our pilot site in the Bremer catchment, the interest into making the river healthy is really spread across all actors, across all sectors, and vertically and horizontally. And so we're really looking with our project as well within this institutional analysis, looking at how we actually make sure that there's coherence and coordination across everything that is happening. We're really trying not to reinvent the wheel with our project, and that's why we have this network. And everyone that we've approached, everyone is very busy, but everyone we've approached is really keen to actually take time to meet and to discuss and to meet again and to discuss again to make sure that we all work together. The community participation talk that I did today is more about how we're not still just relying on the experts, and we're not relying only on the small groups of communities that will keep being integrated in, the big projects, because there are the community members who are coming at night to the local council meetings and who are answering to the surveys, that we're also trying to kind of reach out to the average Joe. And that's why we make an emphasis on community participation, but we are also integrating the whole array of projects and programs that are relevant in the area.
Thanks very much, Astrid. I'd love to know how to say the average Joe in French.
Josephine.
Oh, okay. Okay, so I do have a question up the back there, and then another one.
I have a very quick question for Astrid. As you just mentioned that nature-based solution is a relatively very young terminology. And so how we can make sure that community engagement have been taken into account when we say about nature-based solutions, especially for flood resilience?
Yeah, thanks. That's true. Nature-based solution has a capital N and a capital S. And it's really just a new way of talking about something that has been happening forever. The only thing is that nature-based solution compared to blue-green infrastructure or just land care groups having a cup of tea on Sunday afternoon, nature-based solution is having this idea that we're bringing in also the co-benefits in the conversation. And so when we're actually engaging with communities, local association, but also other programs and other universities, we're always, making a point at defining what we understand by nature-based solutions and kind of opening it to whatever you want to call it today. It doesn't really matter. And try to really work more on the explanation of what nature-based solution is understood, because it is quite possible that in 10 years we'll find another trendy phrase to talk about it. And we're pretty prepared to integrate that in our reports. But in general, we're really trying to give this thorough explanation of what we're trying to achieve. And so far, when we've been talking, there's quite a good understanding also. There's the idea that we just describe what are examples of nature-based solutions, but we're still working on it within our teams of experts, because sometimes we still have those heated debates of whether this is a green or a gray infrastructure. But yeah.
Thanks very much. And I have another online question from Jenny for Caroline. Caroline, what happens if all insurance companies go under? Can the government step in?
That's a very good question, and I hesitate to speculate on kind of that particular timeline, shall we say, of the multiverse. One thing to note is that in contexts, for example, like the United States, there is a parallel public insurance infrastructure, especially for housing. It's called FAIR. And if you sort of want to learn more about this, there's a terrific book by Kaylee Horan called The Insurance Era that tracks the rise of that kind of public infrastructure, and particularly the hard fought effort by the private insurance sector to kill it, or to sort of defang it, to make it sort of expensive and not very workable. So there's long been a struggle between kind of private insurance and kind of public insurance kind of facilities. So kind of how that will kind of settle in the future is an unknown. But what we are seeing in this particular context is lots of creative partnerships between public and private kind of institutions, and using kind of various financing mechanisms to bring kind of public concerns around kind of questions of equity to make sure that communities are kind of robustly insured and not just the kind of most kind of wealthy or those who are able to access these particular financial services, kind of having those benefits can flow on. We're sort of noting in the global space that regional agreements are much more successful than either kind of individual policies or even national kind of agendas. That if you're sort of looking regionally at coalitions for public kind of purposes, that those are quite successful. And Lee Johnson's work on this is really quite remarkable. So all that's to say that there's lots of branches of the multiverse where I can imagine kind of different arrangements between public and private financing. What we should all be concerned about is making sure that those benefits are kind of equitable. We do know that private markets are not particularly good at that, of kind of ensuring equitable solutions. So when we think about those public-private partnerships, kind of putting the emphasis on that more holistic kind of view of values, taking into account non-economic values when we're trying to understand kind of rebuilding and sort of pre-disaster resilience, and also the kind of settlements between public and private kind of organizations, bringing those values to the fore would be really important.
Thanks very much. I think we probably have time for just one more question from, oh, thanks, Renee.
Hi, my question is for all of the panel, and it'd be if you had just one piece of advice for policymakers, what would it be?
Can I start? Invest in technology for early fire detection. Yep, that's brief.
Me too. Oh, invest in solutions for disasters that are actually going to be transformational and be successful, rather than just hope and pray that if we build a few levees and here and there and burn a bit of fuel here and there, that we'll succeed in stopping these catastrophic disasters that we're clearly not being successful at stopping.
I would say to maybe invest and push a little bit more of integrated work, because governments still stay quite sectoral and like the different departments are working in silos. And the thing is that we cannot achieve any of that within only one sector. And that is one of the big challenges that we're facing right now.
And last, I suppose that my sort of advice or concern would be to sort of refocus on whether we're talking about resilience of the financial system when we're talking about kind of insurance and its role in disaster finance, or if we're talking about the resilience of end users, community, and to really be clear-sighted about where those priorities lie.
And on that note, I will draw this session to a close. I'm sure you all had a great day and you've learned a huge amount. I'd like you to give all of our speakers a round of applause. So